Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining today's webinar, which will be presenting findings from our recently released report, Quantifying the Financial Impacts of Electric Vehicles on Utility Ratepayers and Shareholders. My name is Andy Satchwell, and I'm a research scientist and deputy leader in Berkeley Lab's Electricity Markets and Policy Group. I'm joined today by James Milford, who is Director of Consulting at Lumina, as well as our co-authors JP Carvalho, Pete Kappers, and Hadi Ashraghi. Before we get into the details of this study, we certainly want to acknowledge and thank the DOE's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Strategic Analysis team that supported and funded this work. And just one housekeeping note, we will be saving time at the end for question and answer. So throughout the course of the slides here today, feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A box on Zoom, and then we'll return to those and facilitate the questions at the end. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'm also going to put a link in the chat for everyone, which is a link to the report and the supplemental information, which is the basis for today's webinar. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and get started. So EVs can provide financial upside to electric utilities and ratepayers in several ways. So for example, from the utility perspective, EVs could drive increased electricity sales and new earnings opportunities through increased capital investments. From the ratepayer perspective, increased electric loads from EVs could reduce all-in average retail rates. The degree to which there are net benefits or net costs to shareholders and ratepayers depends on how EVs are integrated and managed through enabling grid investments and charging strategies. So this study estimates the utility earnings and customer rate impacts of EVs under bookend charging strategies. We report a reasonable range of financial impacts and bound them across different EV deployment assumptions, including average EV miles traveled, incremental distribution system costs, EV charging locations, and utility EV enablement costs, or in other words, the utility cost to invest in EV charging, controls, and communication, and to deliver and administer electric vehicle programs. This study quantifies financial impacts using Berkeley Lab's Financial Impacts of Distributed Energy Resources, or FINDER model. This mimics the electric utility investment planning and rate-making processes of an investor-owned utility. We assume utility financial and operational characteristics that represent a generic summer peaking vertically integrated utility. And our EV impacts are on key utility financial drivers, specifically retail sales, peak demand, and costs, and are characterized across a number of analytical scenarios using bounded but reasonable estimates. And we use publicly available data sources and tools, for example, NREL's EVI Pro Lite tool, as the basis for our assumptions. We define two bookend charging strategies based on how they perform in meeting a particular objective at every point in time during the analysis period, which is a 20-year forward look. In this study, the objective for our charging strategies relates to system peak impacts, specifically a low peak impact charging strategy, which minimizes impacts on system peak demand, while high peak impact charging maximizes these impacts. We also consider the magnitude of the incremental EV charging load and whether it sets a new utility annual peak demand. Many utility costs, especially generation capacity and energy costs, are driven by system peak demand. By focusing on these extremes, our analysis can quantify the maximum range of financial impacts, knowing that actual impacts will likely fall somewhere within this range. Performance-based charging strategies, like the ones we use in this study, adapt over time to reflect the achievement of an identified objective. One advantage of the performance-based approach is that it enables representation of the hourly EV charging profile that best meets the objective, as well as how this profile changes over time as EV penetration increases. We represent this in the illustrative figure on the right. Other possible objectives for performance-based charging strategies include minimizing renewable curtailment, minimizing distribution system loading or costs, and maximizing the load shifting or shedding value of electric vehicles. These were not addressed here, but could be addressed in subsequent studies. In contrast to the performance-based approach, attribute-based charging strategies are based on the attributes associated with charging profiles. Attribute-based charging strategies are rooted in past and current driving behavior and/or vehicle characteristics, for example, overnight charging or drivetrains, and these may become inefficient in the future. There are a number of important study boundaries to keep in mind as we present the results. First, we compare outcomes across a range of charging strategies, EV deployment characteristics, and adoption levels. However, we are not modeling an optimal level of EV adoption that minimizes customer electricity and transportation costs or to achieve other economic objectives. Second, we model a generic utility intended to be illustrative of a summer peaking vertically integrated utility and explore incremental impacts of light-duty electric vehicles. This study does not evaluate a range of different utility physical and financial characteristics, medium and heavy-duty EVs, or other specific EV charging strategies. Third, we quantify financial impacts on utility shareholder earnings and average customer rates. We do not quantify rate impacts by customer class or compare EV versus non-EV owner electricity bills, though we note that is a topic for future research. We'll now provide an overview of the study's analytical approach, including key assumptions and methodology. As I mentioned earlier, the study uses Berkeley Lab's Finder model. This is a pro forma financial model of changes in utility costs and revenues with the addition of distributed energy resources, or DERs. The model emphasizes the representation of the utility planning and rate-making processes and utility accounting mechanisms. Model outputs include shareholder metrics like achieved return on equity and earnings, and ratepayer metrics like average retail rates and bills. The Finder model has been developed over more than 14 years and has been used to support foundational research and state technical assistance in 7 states and 2 regions. Throughout these projects, the Finder model has been publicly reviewed and vetted. And the study utilizes enhancements to the resource planning module that incorporates utility generation capacity expansion and dispatch optimization. This allows us to ensure that EV load is being served by cost-effective supply resources. James will go into more detail about these new Finder capabilities shortly. The analysis is built around 2 research questions. We first establish the financial impacts of EVs under a high peak impact charging strategy compared to a future without incremental electric vehicles. We use the high peak impact charging strategy to represent an upper bound of possible financial impacts. We then identify the effectiveness of a low peak impact charging strategy in mitigating financial impacts under the high peak impact charging strategy. This analysis also explores sensitivity and robustness of results across 4 sensitivity cases that vary EV deployment characteristics and the subsequent impacts on utility retail sales, peak demand, and direct costs. The second analysis question may be of interest to states and utilities exploring the possible benefits of more targeted or managed charging strategies. We report 3 financial metrics in this study. First, utility achieved after-tax earnings are intended to represent future utility earnings opportunities that take into account the difference between collected revenues and utility costs in each year of the analysis period. Second, ratepayer all-in average retail rates are intended to represent total rate impacts across all utility ratepayers in this study and take into account utility collected revenues divided by total electricity retail sales in each year. Third, annual costs per EV are intended to represent the incremental annual utility costs of integrating electric vehicles and are inclusive utility generation, distribution, EV program, and charging control costs. All financial metrics are discounted over 20 years. We assume a 7% nominal discount rate for utility earnings. This represents the average utility weighted average cost of capital, and a 5% nominal rate for average all-in retail rates and cost per EV. Discount rates are consistent with prior Berkeley Lab financial impact studies. We model a US vertically integrated utility intended to be generally representative of a summer peaking utility with average costs and cost growth. The model input assumptions for our utility are based on recent historical data, largely from the last 2 to 3 years, and do not incorporate impacts of changes to federal or state policies like clean energy tax credits or other trends in future utility costs and loads for things like via building electrification. We assume the utility collects revenue via flat average rates and does not have revenue decoupling. Based on our input assumptions and prior to adding electric vehicles, the modeled total non-fuel costs grow at 4.3% compound annual rate, while total fuel and purchase power costs grow at about a 2.9% compound annual growth rate between 2021 and 2040. The modeled average all-in retail rate is about 12.3 cents per kilowatt hour in 2021 and grows at a compound annual rate of 3.7% per year through 2040. This roughly doubles the retail rate in 2040 to about 24.8 cents per kilowatt hour. Annual EV impacts on retail electricity sales are based on the share of light-duty vehicle stock and average daily vehicle miles traveled. Assumptions are consistent with scenarios in NREL's Electrification Future Study from 2018 and meant to be representative, if not necessarily comprehensive. So compared to 2021, the three EV adoption scenarios are, first, a low EV penetration scenario. This represents 8% of LDV stock is electric vehicles and an approximate 1.5% increase in 2040 retail electricity sales. A high EV penetration scenario representing about 56% of the LDV stock is electric and an approximate 9% increase in 2040 retail electricity sales. We also develop a sensitivity case assuming high vehicle miles traveled that represents about a 14% increase in 2040 retail electricity sales. This was based on the highest vehicle mile traveled assumption in NREL's public EVI Pro Lite tool. Utility distribution capital expenditures and O&M costs are modeled exogenously outside Finder. EV charging can trigger distribution system upgrades when demand exceeds certain thresholds. Because a utility-specific model was not available for this study, we developed a reasonable proxy based on expert elicited probabilities of feeder upgrades and costs driven by EV impacts on coincident peak and non-coincident peak demand. We use the non-coincident maximum residential EV charging demand as the power level to inform secondary distribution system upgrades, and coincident peak demand as the power level to inform primary system and substation upgrades. Utility EV enablement costs are also modeled exogenously outside of Finder. These represent the ratepayer-funded costs of implementing utility EV programs and utility-owned EV charging infrastructure. This includes direct ownership and customer rebates. We exclude host site investment costs, in other words, EV owner, workplace, or municipal cost contributions. Utility EV enablement cost assumptions in our study are based on publicly available utility regulatory filing data, as well as caps on program size intended to represent the utility market share of EV charging infrastructure. Additional charger control and communication costs are assumed to enable implementation of a low peak impact charging strategy. So with that, I'm now actually going to pass the mic over to James, who's going to cover more detail about the generator capacity expansion and dispatch logic. James?
Yes, thank you, Andy. And I'd also like to briefly thank Berkeley Lab for giving Lumina the opportunity to contribute to this effort. I'm going to briefly describe why we built the generator capacity expansion and dispatch module and describe what it does. So like Finder, we built this module in the analytics software platform, and that permitted a fully integrated model for conducting these types of analyses. I want to begin by reviewing how the capacity expansion and dispatch relates to customer retail rates and shareholder earnings. So on this slide, let's start with the capital investments in generating capacity that's on the left side of the screen. What we see is even without EV loads, utilities are likely to build new plants to meet load growth. As EV loads are added to the grid, it may require that utilities build additional power plants to meet that load. We wanted to know how much incremental investment in generating capacity would be required to meet the incremental EV load. If we move on to the center of the slide that describes generator dispatch, we see that once you have a fleet of generators with enough capacity to meet load, the next question is which generators are likely to be used for energy production? Generator technologies have different operating capabilities and operating costs. And adding EVs to load can change which plant types are best suited for generating energy. So the mix of generation can change along with the average cost of generation. Finishing on the right side of the screen, we can tally up the capital and operating expenses, which influence the calculation of retail rates and shareholder earnings. The bottom right figure shows the difference in expenses between a scenario with and without EVs. This figure highlights how incremental capital investments are likely to be a bigger contributor to changes in rates and earnings than the operating costs. And this is a major reason why the study evaluated different charging strategies, because lowering the peak period impacts of EV charging will help reduce the need for incremental generating capacity and capital expenses. Next slide, please. From a power planner's perspective, they need to ensure that there's adequate generating capacity in every hour of the year. The center figure illustrates the differences in hourly system load for 3 scenarios. The red line is the load without EVs. The blue line is a scenario with high EV adoption and low peak impacts. And the green line is the high EV adoption and high peak impacts. The figure on the right zooms in on the summer peak hours, and it highlights how magnitude and timing of load can differ among scenarios. Most notably, the green high EV adoption with high peak impact curve shows a spike relative to the other curves. This reflects a scenario where EV owners set their charging timers to turn on around midnight to take advantage of off-peak pricing. As a power planner, this could indicate that you might need more generator capacity or ramping capability. The team specifically designed the capacity expansion and dispatch optimization model to account for these considerations. Next slide, please. All right, there's a lot of great features that we included in the capacity expansion optimization, but I want to spare you from all the details. The most technical thing I'll say is that it relies on a mixed integer linear program. So let's briefly describe the most important considerations that we wanted this optimization to address. At the highest level, the optimization needs to identify a technology-specific capacity additions and retirements plan that minimizes capital and operating expenses over a long run horizon. Moreover, we wanted to ask the question of whether or not it's economical to retire capacity or simply mothball that capacity until a future need arises. Is it more economical to add small plants to meet incremental load, or is it better to add large plants with future growth in mind? Will the fleet of generators be able to ramp up or down to meet hour-to-hour load variability? Is there enough reserve capacity throughout each hour of the year to handle unexpected events? Can renewable energy provide firm capacity? And if so, what times of the year would that capacity be firm? Was enough renewable energy provided to meet statewide standards? And how far can you ramp down power plants before you surpass their minimum loading levels and they need to shut down? So certainly this is not a comprehensive list of all grid planning considerations, but the team felt that it addressed the most important factors for this study question. Next slide, please. After determining the generating capacity available over the study, we then optimized the hourly dispatch for each study year. Again, the most critical question here is, what is the best way to optimally dispatch the generators to minimize operating costs? And while doing so, we needed to ensure that we were respecting operating constraints such as maximum ramp up and down rates, minimum loading levels, and minimum up and down times. The module also takes a look at how much energy can be purchased economically from markets. Again, is there compliance with renewable portfolio standards? All right, next slide. Okay, so what did we achieve? The objectives were to find a least cost capacity resource plan. We did that. We needed a tool that would recognize trade-offs in near-term capital and long-run operating costs. The approach needed to ensure resource adequacy. And lastly, we needed to respect the key generator operating constraints. All of those criteria were met in this study. And lastly, it's worth noting that this approach, although we focused on electric vehicles, it's equally applicable to other electric distributed energy resources, such as PV, batteries, electrification technologies like heat pumps, energy efficiency, and demand response. Thanks, Andy.
Yeah, thanks, James. Great overview, and certainly very exciting to think about the ways in which we can use the Finder model going forward with this awesome capacity expansion and dispatch logic. So with that, we'll transition next into the actual study results. So we're going to start with the first analysis question. Here we explore the financial impacts of electric vehicles under a high peak impact charging strategy. Again, it was that performance-based bookend strategy that maximizes the peak impacts. The comparison point for these results is a utility without any incremental EV deployment. So compared to a scenario without incremental EVs, and again, assuming EV charging is highly coincident with utility system peak demand under our high peak impact charging strategy, all-in average retail rates increase modestly, about 0.5% at low EV penetration, and slightly decrease, about a 0.1% reduction at high EV penetration. Retail rate changes depend on whether costs increase faster than retail sales. I'll detail important timing considerations of these rate increases in the following slide. Utility shareholder earnings increase about 2.2% to 4.7%, especially as EV penetration levels increase. This increase is a result of higher generation and distribution system investments to accommodate the EV load, as well as a portion of EV program and enablement costs that we assume are capitalized. This really ties into what James showed on that slide, that these capital cost increases could be quite significant depending on the EV charging strategy. And these incremental capital investments increase the utility rate base and subsequently the utility earnings. Although large early infrastructure investments cause rates to initially rise, sales increases from EV load at high EV penetration in particular cause average rates to drop substantially over time. For example, a 2.9% reduction in rates between 2035 and 2040. At low EV penetration, investments in generation and distribution infrastructure are not sufficiently offset in any time period shown here by sales growth, which would otherwise cause rates to decline, though the increase in retail rates slows in later years of the analysis period. Rate increases, for example, this 1.2% increase between 2030 and 2035 at low EV penetration, are particularly sensitive to large, lumpy investment costs. For example, from the addition of new generating plants, which account for about 48 to 61% of our total incremental capital investment. We move to the second analysis question, exploring how a low peak impact charging strategy affects financial impacts and how robust the results are to different deployment assumptions. Our comparison point for the following results is a utility with incremental EVs deployed under our upper end high peak impact charging strategy. So EVs deployed under low peak impact charging reduce average retail rates, about 0.8 to 1% reduction. This is through lowering incremental generation and distribution system investment costs. The low peak impact charging reduces coincident peak demand relative to the high peak impact charging strategy, but it maintains the same level of energy. This results in fewer demand-driven costs that are spread over the same level of retail sales. Shareholder earnings are also reduced under the low peak impact charging strategy, about a 1.9 to 2.4% reduction, because reductions in new generation and distribution infrastructure investments erode some of the incremental earnings. It's important to note, however, that utility shareholders are still better off compared to a future without EVs, even under this low peak impact charging strategy. Incremental distribution and generation investments, as well as capitalized EV charging infrastructure, increase equity rate base and provide a financial upside to shareholders. Low peak impact EV charging strategies reduce these incremental generation and distribution capital expenditure costs relative to the high peak impact charging strategy, again, as a result of lowering peak demand impacts. Though incremental capitalized EV program costs are assumed to be slightly higher under our low peak impact charging, because we make an assumption that additional charging controls and communication costs are necessary to accommodate that low peak impact charging strategy. The low peak impact charging reduces total incremental CapEx costs between 29% and 86%, depending on the EV penetration level. The results across the sensitivity cases are all directionally consistent with the core case results. In other words, all cases reduce average retail rates when you compare low peak impact to high peak impact charging. The range of impacts to shareholders is larger than it is to ratepayers due to differences in what types of costs change. So average retail rates are affected by all costs, whereas shareholder earnings are affected by and particularly sensitive to changes in capital expenditure costs. Among the sensitivity cases we explored comparing low peak impact to high peak impact charging, we found that where EV charging occurs produces some sensitivity in the results. Increasing the amount of charging at public or workplace locations shifts charging from mostly nighttime, when residential charging tends to occur, to midday hours. A shift to more public workplace charging results in a charging profile that was similar to our high peak impact charging strategy, thus reducing the difference between the low and the high peak impact charging strategies. One implication of this finding is that workplace charging may encourage midday load building, which may or may not be economically efficient from a utility cost perspective. We also see that improvements in EV charging management strategies, for example, through this low peak impact charging strategy, may have a big impact on the annual cost of integrating electric vehicles, especially under our low EV penetration case, where we saw about a $380 per EV cost reduction, compared to a reduction of $180 per EV in the high EV penetration case. The managed charging costs per EV are inclusive of the benefits of lower total capital expenditure and operational costs that were presented earlier, plus the ratepayer funded portion of incremental control and communication costs that enable this low peak impact charging. The cost per EV results could be used to inform customer or shareholder incentive designs to promote low peak impact charging strategies, though I would note that these incentives would be a new and incremental cost that would increase average all-in retail rates. We also think that these results can inform utility planners and power system analysis about a range of costs to integrate EVs, potentially even using them, for example, as a rule of thumb. We'll now move into conclusions and some key findings, and certainly I encourage people to start entering questions into the Q&A box, which we can answer here shortly. So we wanted you to take away a few key findings from our study results. We find that ratepayers are always better off if EVs are deployed with low peak impact charging strategies because of these lower cost impacts. This suggests that pricing and programs to encourage non-coincident peak charging are highly beneficial from the ratepayer perspective. Compared to a future without EVs, shareholders are also better off across all of our scenarios. But this low peak impact charging, which could be a proxy for managed charging, reduces new generation and distribution infrastructure investments. As a result, it erodes some of the incremental earnings. Large initial utility infrastructure investments enable both greater EV deployments and greater long-term decreases in retail electricity rates. These investments also lead to near-term rate increases. And importantly, this represents a shift from the recent utility environment of declining sales and limited new generation capital investments. I think an important implication of the timing of these rate increases is that a forward-looking, long-term perspective can overcome these near-term rate increases, which enable the deployment of this type of infrastructure. The rate impacts in the study are overall quite small on a total utility basis, but they could be more significant for certain customer classes depending on cost allocation and cost recovery methodologies. Of course, this study does not explore those, but they could be a topic for future study. Furthermore, even under the high peak impact charging and rather pronounced increases in system costs, we find that the ratepayer impacts were not too severe. We think this likely gives decision makers adequate time to address related concerns. And finally, the managed or low peak impact charging strategy we modeled was based on the aggregate EV charging profile that minimized utility system peak impacts. Remember, it was that performance-based objective. Implementing this type of an optimal strategy would require dynamic infrastructure planning processes and/or flexible managed charging strategies that could reflect how the utility load shape evolves over time as you add EV load. For example, EV time of use periods might change from overnight to middle of the day as the coincident peak EV load impacts increase over time. And finally, as a scoping study, we want to identify a number of future research opportunities that come out of this. Some of them include assuming different EV penetration levels and adoption rates, modeling medium duty and heavy duty electric vehicles, incorporating a more detailed distribution cost model, potentially exploring additional charging strategies and profiles, other utility, physical and financial characteristics, and customer class level impacts, as well as potentially modeling EV-specific rate designs and quantifying cost shifts between EV owners and non-EV owners. Again, thank you for participating today and joining. We'll now move to questions and encourage you all to submit questions into the Q&A box. So the first question that we have is asking about the timing of the generation and distribution investments. The question says, for example, are the investments made before the EV need materializes or just in time? And also whether we examined impact on rates if those investments are delayed. So I will take a stab at answering this, but certainly James, feel free to jump in and speak specifically to how we consider the timing of future generation capital investments. So we assume a fixed EV penetration level. So what that means is that the utility retail sales are going to change in each year going forward. We look at the needed investments on the distribution side largely in that year, and that produces an annual schedule of distribution system investment costs. So if anything, it was sort of made just in time on the distribution side. James, do you want to say a little bit about how you guys considered this EV load growth and how that affected the timing of generation investments?
Yeah, the capacity expansion model assumes that capacity is available when needed. So the capital costs can be kind of like spread out to prior years to reflect construction time, I guess would be important to say.
So to some extent, the investments were made a little bit before the EV need was materialized, but certainly the optimization model ensured that we weren't overbuilding capacity to meet that need, right?
Correct.
And no, we didn't, to finish this question, we didn't examine the impact on rates if the timing of those investments was delayed or otherwise shifted. There's another question just asking about the probability of triggering a distribution upgrade and whether those probabilities are calculated independently. So again, our distribution cost methodology was exogenous to Finder, and we used publicly available estimates of and probabilities of distribution system upgrades, depending on whether or not our EV charging strategies increase coincident peak demand and non-coincident peak demand. I will say that the probabilities, these publicly available probabilities of triggering a distribution system upgrade, whether at the secondary, primary, or substation level, they're pretty wide-ranging and don't have a lot of precision to them. And we sort of try to generalize them. So in some cases, reaching a certain threshold from the EV load simply triggered an upgrade in the distribution system. But we didn't necessarily find an optimal strategy in which maybe chargers could be distributed sort of more widely within the distribution network to maybe lower some of those costs. So again, it was developed exogenously with those probabilities. There's a question about the assumption for the number and cost of transformer upgrades. So at the link that I shared at the beginning of the chat, and which is available on our website, there's where we host the report. We also have a supplemental information document. I think it's probably approaching 30, maybe 40 pages of very good technical details. And there we identify all of the probability tables for our distribution system upgrades as well as our cost assumptions. We will be posting the recording of this webinar on our website as well if you want to return to it for other reference. I'll leave the Q&A box open for just a little bit longer to see if there's any additional questions. There's a question here about what level of home-based charging we assumed. So the EVI, NREL's EVI Pro Lite tool gives you the level 1, level 2, and DCFC chargers given a set of assumptions. And so for residential-based charging, we assumed some mix of level 1 and level 2 charging that came out of EVI Pro Lite. There's a question about how we calculated the customer rate impact. For example, what assumptions did we apply to the customer rate structure? So again, we assumed that the utility was collecting all revenues via flat average volumetric retail rate. The customer rate impact that we show here is simply the utility's collected revenues divided by the total sales in a given year. And then we discount those using the discount rates I mentioned earlier. So you could think of this as a rate impact on average across all customers. If there was a different rate design, like a time of use rate or some other non-flat rate design, you would just allocate those costs differently between the peak and the off-peak periods, for example. But on average, the rate impacts would be consistent regardless of rate design. I'll wait just a few moments here to see if there are any additional questions. So one question about transmission investments or just distribution. So we included incremental generation and distribution costs. We didn't include a transmission investment cost as part of the cost modeling. One excellent question asking, are any recommendations we might have for improving rate design based on this analysis? I think that's a question that gets into a lot of issues around not only just from the financial side, how you allocate some of these costs to different classes and then into different rate periods, but also what the overall rate objective here is. I think one thing that this study suggests is that there is value to ratepayers from more targeted or managed charging strategies. So rate designs that tend to encourage those types of behaviors, whether they are time of use rates or incentive-based programs to shift EV charging to low peak impact times, are really beneficial. And so perhaps rate designs to achieve that objective can be designed in a way that reflects some of those benefits, maybe by offering rate discounts or high incentive payments to enable that type of response. There's a question about the timing of the rate impacts. So in the chart that we showed earlier, in fact, I can go back to it here to clarify here. So what we're showing here is the change in the 5-year average nominal retail rate under the high peak impact charging compared to no electric vehicles. So what we see is the average rate over a 5-year period across our analysis time. And so here we can again see that the timing of infrastructure investments and when the EV sales occur, the change in sales from EVs occur, really matters for the rate impacts. I've been working on this topic of financial impacts of BERs for about 14 years now. This was probably the most surprising finding to me, and I thought was actually quite interesting. And I think it suggests especially that decision makers and utilities and other stakeholders should not have necessarily myopic views of rate impacts, but take into account the full period. Because if you had a short-term view of rate impacts, you might incorrectly assume that EVs were going to put significant upward pressure on rates. But taking into account the full time period is really important to understand that. A question about NEVI, Inflation Reduction Act, and other federal funds, correct, we did not factor those into the results here. They would affect probably both the generation capacity expansion plan, because it would make certain generation supply resources more economic if those incentives were taken into account, as well as potentially some incentives driving different adoption and EV penetration levels. Certainly that would be an interesting, I think, next study topic to include. A question about how the results might vary from one utility to another and what those key drivers would be. When it comes right down to it, these financial impacts are driven by the ways in which retail sales, peak demand, and costs change. So what really matters is the underlying shape of the utility load and its level of sales, as well as what its underlying cost structure is and how much of that cost varies between fixed costs versus sort of variable costs, especially in the short term. So again, an area of future research would certainly be to look at other utility characterizations and see whether different proportions of fixed and non-fixed costs would change these results, as well as maybe a utility that was really peaky or one that was not necessarily so. And then there's a question about if non-peak EV charging was motivated through a specific rate design. So for example, a lower rate discount to encourage off-peak charging, would we expect to see that erode the average rate benefit for non-EV customers? No, in fact, if there was a rate design that was really encouraging off-peak charging, that's what we intended to represent through our low peak impact charging strategy. So in fact, such a rate design would result in these types of average rate decreases. And these are average rate decreases that would be experienced by all customers, both those that own EVs as well as that don't own EVs. So that's an important kind of benefit overall for all ratepayers. So I think with that, we've exhausted the Q&A box here. Some excellent questions. Thank you all for submitting those. Certainly, I want to conclude by showing our contact information on the Berkeley Lab team side. Feel free to reach out to us with any additional questions. And again, a recording of this webinar will be posted to our electricity markets and policy website, as well as the report we described today and the supplemental information. So again, thanks to James and Hadi and the entire Lumina team for partnering with us on this study and really expanding the capabilities of the Finder model. We look forward to continuing this line of research and exploring some of the topics that we mentioned here today. So with that, we will end the webinar. Again, thank you for your participation.